And joining us now to discuss the indictment against former FBI Director James Comey is legal analyst Keith Gross. He's a former assistant state attorney and prosecutor for the state of Florida. He's also the author of the book Dirt Roads to Runways, Defending the American Dream for the Next Generation. Okay, good afternoon to you, Keith. Can you explain for us what the DOJ must prove here in this case against Comey?
So Comey's been indicted for 2 felony counts, and each of them have specific elements. And the way it works generally is that the prosecutor has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt each of the elements that constitute the given crime. So for the first charge, making a false statement, on that one, they have to prove that the defendant made a false statement, a representation that was factually untrue, or that he concealed a material fact, that the falsehood was material. So it's not just a small error, it's a significant difference from the truth, and that he did so knowingly, willingly. When we get to the second charge, obstruction of a congressional proceeding, there's a similar set of elements, and essentially it includes the element that there must also be an official investigation or inquiry underway, and that the defendant knew or had some notice of the proceeding, and that the defendant acted with corrupt intent to influence or impede the proceeding through lies or obstruction.
I mean, Keith, how do you prove that? How do prosecutors establish that a false statement was knowingly made?
Well, usually you're going to have to look at information where you can determine what the person who made the statement knew at the time. You know, you can look at documents or emails, other communications. You might have other witnesses who say, I told him this, or he told me that. And those witnesses could serve to prove the level of knowledge that Comey had at the time he testified to Congress. And you can see the details as they laid it out in the indictment, where they essentially recited the elements like any good prosecutor would when drafting the indictment here. And they made specific allegations about which statement they're talking about, that he had not authorized someone else at the FBI to be an anonymous source in news reports. So based on that specific statement, they're going to look for proof that he did, in fact, authorize someone, either by having a person testify to that, or perhaps they have an intercepted communication.
Okay, Keith, on that second charge, what evidence are we expecting in terms of what the DOJ needs to show to prove that Comey obstructed a Senate investigation?
Essentially, it's all of the elements of the first charge, plus the fact that he did it during an investigation conducted by Congress. The idea being that Congress wanted truthful information from him during his testimony. And when he failed to provide that truthful information and, in fact, willfully lied to Congress, he derailed the investigation that Congress was conducting.
Okay, let's say if Comey's statements were misleading, but it was found out that not intentionally so. Does that change things?
It does. You know, if it's not intentional, if it's not willful, then it would be much more difficult to prove these charges. But that gets to be a bit of a subjective analysis that the jury is going to get into based on testimony and evidence presented at the eventual trial in this matter. During the trial, the prosecutors will demonstrate enough facts to show that what he did was intentional. And intentional from a legal perspective doesn't necessarily mean what we think of it when we discuss it in lay terms. Intentional can be proven not by examining the contents of Comey's mind, which of course would be impossible, but by looking at enough facts around the circumstance to show that he knew what he was doing and he did it intentionally, because you can show a pattern of activity, like perhaps he communicated with others or documented what he was going to do in some way.
And also, can you talk to us about what to expect for the possible defenses that Comey's legal team might raise?
They're probably going to raise defenses around each of the elements in question. You know, they would probably work to argue the materiality of the misstatement. To the extent it was false, it wasn't very false. It was just slightly different from what reality turned out to be, or that he did not know the truth at the time he made the statement, and he did, in fact, testify to the best of his knowledge at the time.
And how strong is this case? What does it mean that the grand jury, rejected one of the proposed counts against Comey? Is that significant?
Well, we don't really know how significant the evidence is in this case because we haven't really seen much of the evidence here in the public. Grand jury proceedings are entirely secret, and so we also don't know their reasoning for why they rejected one of the counts. When you see a grand jury indictment, it doesn't necessarily imply a high probability of guilt. It's very easy to get an indictment from a grand jury because it is a one-sided, closed-door proceeding where only the prosecutor is heard. Defense is generally not heard in these cases in the grand jury proceeding. So the grand jury, seeing only one side of the story, generally does choose to indict.
Okay, there's another thing I wanted your comments on. Can you explain for us what the Crossfire Hurricane investigation was? It dominated headlines for a long time, right? And found nothing incriminating about President Trump's 2016 campaign.
So based on the Steele dossier, which we now know was funded by the Clinton campaign, it seems that there was a whole of government response in many ways against President Trump's campaign, even before he was elected and immediately afterwards. This ultimately was what we now often refer to as Russiagate, where there was some implication that Donald Trump and his associates were under the influence of Russian operatives. That's since been pretty well disproven. The problem is the facts that were used to prop up this hoax were generated through political means. There were people paid off by the Clinton campaign, and ultimately, they used it to get warrants to secretly spy on Trump and his associates. One FBI agent has already gone to jail for his role in lying to the court for the process of getting that secret warrant through the FISA court.
So, Keith, journalist John Solomon said on the Epoch Times program called American Thought Leaders that this investigation hampered the first few years of the first Trump administration, that it stole diplomatic opportunities and thwarted security opportunities as well. Do you see it that way? Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. I think that in common terms, this rose to the level of treason. The way that the Trump administration's first term was derailed. The people of the United States voted for 4 years of Donald Trump when they elected him to his first term. And they probably got less than a year and a half of that term in true benefit because there were multiple hoaxes, there were multiple impeachments. The government worked against our own president, the people that were supposed to be loyal to him in the executive branch, who ultimately, legally speaking, answer to the president, were actively sabotaging him. They were seeking to essentially operate as a coup to destabilize an elected president.
Okay, Keith, just one last question here. How significant are the penalties, potential penalties in this case against Comey? What happens next in this case? Could this take a long time before a ruling?
It could probably be a year and a half to 2.5 years before we see progress in the way of a trial and ultimate sentencing. Both of these counts are felony counts. Each of them comes with a 5-year prison term as a maximum, which if they were combined, he's looking at 10 years in prison. Plus, because they are felony convictions, it comes with all the other relevant trappings of a felony conviction. No longer allowed to possess firearms, no longer allowed to vote, etc.
Okay, Keith, really enjoyed hearing your analysis today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.